can be based on trust and can build trust between horse and rider, which is really what we're all after, is a better relationship with our horse. Because when a horse trusts you, as we all know, they will do absolutely anything for you. And when they fear you, they will do what you ask of them and no more. So let's discuss positive versus negative reinforcement. And go ahead and put in the comments real quick if you use more positive or negative reinforcement when you're working with your horse. So this is kind of a hot topic in the equestrian industry right now, or equine industry. I'm sure I'm going to, just by even venturing into this topic, create some interesting conversations. So let's just agree to all be nice and try to hear each other out. But I'm going to share my take on positive versus negative reinforcement and when to use each one. First things first, a lot of people get wrong the definitions of positive and negative reinforcement. So I'm going to define them as I understand them so that going forward throughout this conversation, we can have the same understanding of what I mean when I say either of those terms. So first of all, positive reinforcement works with a dopamine-based system of training in which we give a reward to a horse or any animal based on a behavior that we like and we want to see more of. So an example would be your horse stands at the mounting block. They get a food reward. Dopamine is released in their brain. They then seek more of that, and they start to put together over time that the behavior that got them that dopamine release was standing at the mounting block. So they learn that standing at the mounting block equals dopamine. Standing at the mounting block becomes associated with good things and good feelings, and they then begin to go stand at the mounting block. So a really great example of this that I inadvertently did when I was in high school many years ago was with my show horse, Diligent, who I still love and adore, and to this day believe was the best horse I have ever had and probably ever will. I taught him, he knew already how to smile. So if you put your two fingers on his upper lip, and then you put your hands up in the air, so you kind of, I can't mirror it with this arm right now, but if you did it with both arms and you said smile, he would lift his top lip and do that flame in response, and it looked like a smile. I would get my phone out, he would smile, and he would expect a treat, whether or not I was asking for the smile. So I sort of accidentally reinforced my phone, dopamine release if you smile. So I never got another serious picture of him for the rest of his life, because every time he would see that I had my phone out, he would smile and then expect a treat. So that was a positive reinforcement training gone wrong, but it's a really great example of how horses associate that dopamine receptor. So negative reinforcement, a lot of people hear this and they assume it means you're doing things with force, or you're doing things with any kind of malintent. Your horse doesn't go forward, you kick and spur and hit them with the whip. And that is not necessarily true. That is an extreme form of negative reinforcement. And in some ways, you could argue clearly that works, because that is still the dominant form of horse training. However, is it the most effective? We could also argue, especially with certain cases, certain horses, and certain personality types, it is not. So kind of going back to a real world example, and I'll use a kid in a classroom, right? Like if you don't finish your homework, you don't get to go out to recess. That might get the kid to finish their homework that day, but what's really going to end up happening is going to foster resentment towards school and toward learning, and kill any intrinsic motivation that child has toward learning. So Negative reinforcement doesn't necessarily have anything to do with force or pain, um, like we tend to sometimes have that connotation in our language and our culture. So now that we've defined those, in most cases, I believe, and this may change over my lifetime, I'm open to other understandings and interpretations. And maybe I should preface by saying I grew up like most of us, and I shouldn't even say grew up. I've had the vast majority of my horse experience has been based on a negative reinforcement system. And I think that's very common because it is the dominant method of training and riding in our culture for sure. So, negative reinforcement can be something as simple as I put my leg on and the horse goes forward. That is negative reinforcement. The reason, I should actually add this to the definition of negative reinforcement, the reason that's considered negative reinforcement as opposed to positive reinforcement is because your leg goes on, that's pressure being added. It's not necessarily uncomfortable or scary to the horse, it's just a pressure. The horse goes forward, they do the behavior that you like, your leg comes off, the pressure is released. So the learning happens with the release of the pressure. In that sense, we can talk about the kid that got the punishment, right? Or the horse that gets punished for not listening. That is an extreme form of negative reinforcement. There's also a very gentle form of negative reinforcement in which it's just simply body language. You're adding pressure and taking away pressure as the horse reacts to what you're communicating with them. And so I definitely grew up in the more gentle version with, that being the norm, that you put your leg on, the horse goes forward, move the whip and the horse moves away from you. You get big and the horse backs up, right? There's these things where, the baseline of most training systems is based on the idea that horses respond to pressure. And it is effective. It also can really easily be abused because the idea that horses respond to pressure then also would indicate that if the horse isn't responding, more pressure is the answer. And that's where we get people abusing things like whips and spurs and using punishment when the horse doesn't respond, which that's where we can kind of get into trouble, if that makes sense. So, okay, I grew up and had most of my riding career so far, and I still use a lot of negative reinforcement in this very gentle way. When I teach riding lessons, I don't explain all of this, but I do teach a really gentle form of negative reinforcement. And I believe that in a healthy horse-human relationship, negative reinforcement is almost unavoidable because it is the language that horses use with each other, right? Horses aren't going around giving each other treats. And this is where, stick with me if you're a positive reinforcement person, because I will come back around to you. Horses aren't going around giving each other treats if they do the right thing, right? The horse isn't saying, when you move away from my hay pile, I'll give you some hay, right? There's no, horses don't exchange food that way. What they do is they say, oh, you're encroaching on my hay pile. I'm going to pin my ears and step toward you, and you're going to move away and go find another hay pile, right? And so that being the main language that horses use, and there is some argument that maybe they're doing other things that we can't even understand or comprehend, and I fully support that thinking. But in terms of what we can perceive and what we can study, we can see that horses use this very gentle and very subtle form of negative reinforcement through body language to communicate with each other. And this is where I think we have the most value as humans in the horse-human relationship, in terms of we can learn how the horses use this very subtle, very gentle pressure and release system to communicate, and we can mimic it in a way that they can understand, and really I think can be very kind, because it's how the horses communicate with each other. It's the language that their mother teaches them from birth. And so in a lot of cases, this can be a very kind and gentle way of communicating with horses. There's also a really strong case for positive reinforcement, at least having a seat at the table when we're having these training discussions, and in some horses, even being the exclusive method of training. So, where positive reinforcement can go beyond what negative reinforcement is able to do is certain behaviors. So, for example, that standing at the mounting block. It's really hard to use negative reinforcement correctly without going to a punishment method to get a horse to stand still, right? If you think about it, you bring the horse to the mounting block, they move a foot away and they kind of turn their hip, or they won't stand still and they keep kind of fidgeting and walking. You have two choices. You could use negative reinforcement, which would tell you to keep moving their feet until they decide to stop, right? Which would be, and then at that point you would take the pressure off. So you would have them circle around and around and around the mounting block until they stop, right? And that is the kind of classic negative reinforcement version. You could also use a whip and hold it over the other side of the horse if they tend to turn their hip, and you can tap their hip until their hip comes back to where you want it to be. And that may not necessarily be forceful or fearful, but it could really easily go there, right? If somebody was unskilled or a less subtle person by nature, it could really easily become sort of a forceful or fearful event for a horse. And then they're standing at the mounting block out of fear and not out of cooperation. And I think baseline horses want to cooperate. So anything we can do to encourage cooperation is going to ultimately help us in the long run to be more effective horse people and have a better relationship with our horse. There's definitely like a little bit of a stigma. It's so funny to me how in our equestrian world, if it's not the way that you do things, we tend to immediately assume that it's wrong, and we tend to look for the negatives, whether it's like, the Western versus English debate, or positive versus negative reinforcement, or whether you use a snaffle bit or a curb. Like, people can get so hung up on what, their way versus everybody else's way. And what ends up happening is it divides our industry and it divides our culture. And I think it really weakens it. And if we could all figure out how to just take a moment to listen and to think about, maybe there's some validity in the way that somebody else does things because they clearly do it for a reason, but maybe we could actually do right by the horses, do better by the horses, and do better by our industry, and maybe help our industry thrive instead of kind of slowly withering away like it's been doing lately. So just a crazy thought I'd like to throw out there. And that's definitely a video for another day. But so basically, I've been riding him. This was before I stopped riding him. And he bucked me off one day because he spooked at something insignificant. It's like a leaf or something, right? But it triggered his fight or flight response because he was already on edge. He spooked, he bucked me off. I came off. I got back on, but I didn't make him work again. I sat on his back. And after he took a big deep breath, I got off and we were done for the day. With this horse, because he had trauma and because he was afraid of people, getting back on and putting him back to work would only, for him in his mind, reinforce the fact that people are scary and that people hurt you and that people make you do things that are uncomfortable and that, put you in danger. And what I was trying to teach him was the exact opposite, that people are safe and that I was listening to him and that I valued his feelings and his perception of the world. And so that's why I waited for him to take a deep breath and then I got off, because what I was rewarding was the relaxation, not the fact that he could trot around the arena and not buck me off. because I know he can trot around the arena. That's not the issue. And so this just brought up for me in that time, in that moment, okay, like there's a use for positive reinforcement that is perhaps very profound for these horses that don't have kind of the cookie cutter upbringing and the cookie cutter training that can work so well for some horses. Some horses can really excel and thrive in that, as we've seen. But some really do need a different approach. So that just proved to me that both methods are important, both methods are useful, and that we need to figure out a way to bridge the gap between the two sides of this conversation and kind of kill the debate, kill the argument, and just accept the fact that different people are going to find different things useful, and that maybe there's something we could learn from other people in this conversation. I just really believe, had I gone the negative reinforcement route, not only would it have taken me a lot longer, but we probably would still be having a lot of explosions. He had really explosive and really unpredictable, spooky behavior before, and we haven't had that since I started clicker training, because it has just completely rewired his perception of the horse-human relationship from one of predator and prey to one of partnership. And that's where I think the real strengths of positive reinforcement training are. So now, with all that said, I also think there are some shortcomings of positive reinforcement training. One is, again, you have to actually teach the horse what that clicker means, or what the, how to perceive positive reinforcement. It's not something that they come already downloaded with that information. They are predisposed to understand it. Of course, they have the biological inclination to respond to positive reinforcement. Otherwise, it wouldn't work so well, right? So, of course, they have the hormones and the neurons and all of the things that they need. The equipment is there, so to speak, right? But they don't necessarily know what to do with that equipment until we show them. So that is something that is maybe a slight shortcoming, but it's very small. I mean, really, especially with a horse that's not traumatized, it only really takes maybe 1 or 2 sessions with the clicker, and they realize that clicker is, means happiness is coming. Okay, settle down now. I'm trying to help you, but you're just a little hyperactive. There we go. Are you good? Okay. So that's one of the shortcomings in my mind of positive reinforcement training. The other shortcoming is, what if you forget your treats one day? Or what if you run out? It happens. Hopefully, if you've done enough of the work, it shouldn't matter. You should be able to still have enough of a solid relationship with your horse that they still perceive all of the things that you're doing as positive. But yeah, it has been an issue for me with Mesa, my rescue boy. When I don't have treats, I have a much harder time even just catching him. And our relationship is really based on food now, which I'm okay with, but it's a little bit more demanding of me in terms of making sure that I'm prepared. I can't just pop out and go grab him and go do my thing, because the way that I communicate with him is through food. So that's another, again, slight shortcoming. It's not that difficult for me to go fill my pockets with hay pellets, and most of the time I just always have hay pellets in my pockets anyway. But that is something that is maybe another slight downside, is the few times I've forgotten, I can't do much with him. And then another slight shortcoming, it puts the burden on the human to really get good at timing and really understand horse behavior. I think in even a little bit more so than negative reinforcement, and I'll clarify what I mean there. So with negative reinforcement, timing is still very important. And this is where I think a lot of times people get too forceful or too strong with their horses, or they end up reverting to a fear-based training system. Now my cat's going crazy. But I think it's fairly straightforward to teach a person how to just scale back on their negative reinforcement and make sure that they're using the most gentle possible approach and to be more subtle, and to teach them timing of when to release pressure, because all you're doing is stopping a behavior, right? So as an example, if I have a rider that rides with too strong of a leg and their horse is getting dull, it's easier for me to explain to them how to add less pressure and wait for the correct response and then take that pressure away as soon as they feel it, and also easier for me to verbally cue them through that than it is for me to teach them how to stop what they're doing and reward the horse, give them a treat, because that's a lot more actions on the human's part that need to be done with equally as instantaneous timing. So it puts a little bit more pressure on the person to learn horse behavior and to get really good at timing. And if they don't do it correctly, they'll often end up inadvertently teaching their horse a behavior that they didn't mean to teach, like me teaching Diligent to smile every time I got my phone out. Or another really common example that I see is like somebody will reward their horse every time the horse allows them to pick their feet, but they'll give the reward after they set the hoof down. And so the horse learns that they get the reward for putting the hoof down, and the horse takes their hoof out of the human's hand and puts it back on the ground before the human is finished picking the hoof. And the human gets frustrated because they're like, I've been trying to teach them with positive reinforcement how to hold their hoof up while I pick the hoof. The horse ends up learning to respond to the cue with an accidental outcome that the human is not really actually wanting. So that is, when done incorrectly, that's the outcome with positive reinforcement. You could definitely argue that the worst case scenario outcome with negative reinforcement is a lot more detrimental than the worst case scenario with positive reinforcement, being that your horse smiles every time you get out your phone, or refuses to hold their hoof up for more than 3 to 5 seconds, and that those behaviors, in some ways, you could reteach those behaviors in a different way. Sort of in effect undoing your mistake, versus with negative reinforcement, sometimes if you go too far and you end up using fear or force, undoing is a lot more difficult, because then you have to earn the horse's trust back. So all that said, I don't know that necessarily one is better or worse. I definitely use both, and in some cases I'll lean more heavily on one or the other depending on the horse that I'm dealing with. But I do think both have a place in a comprehensive training program, in most comprehensive training programs, because I think when used correctly and when used gently and by knowledgeable and skillful people, both can be very kind and can be very rewarding and can be based on trust and can build trust between horse and rider, which is really what we're all after, is a better relationship with our horse. Because when a horse trusts you, as we all know, they will do absolutely anything for you. And when they fear you, they will do what you ask of them and no more. So I definitely think it's well worth everybody's time to learn the ins and outs of both kind and gentle negative reinforcement, as well as effective positive reinforcement. And yeah, I think the world would be a better place if everybody took the time to really study and learn both. Don't forget to subscribe and like this video if you would like to see more content like this. I am just getting started here, but really enjoying it and definitely looking forward to some new topics. I have so many ideas, and definitely if you have things that you would like to see from me, let me know because I'm open to suggestions.